All right, so that's it for strategies. Now we're moving on to the final component of IEPs, which is reporting on it, our data, our beliefs. Anything worth teaching is worth measuring. There's nothing on an IEP that can't be measured. Everything that we can teach, we can measure. However, not all data are created equal. I think I made this point earlier. And for the sake of time and brevity, I'm just going to skip through this quickly. Anecdotes are no good. I remember going to a high school IEP for a parent who was a very strong advocate, and she got really upset with the high school team that she otherwise had a pretty good relationship with, because at the end of the year she was asking about the outcomes of his IEP goals, and each of them was a one-time anecdote from someone in the building. So what's the outcome for his science class? Oh, I talked to the science teacher last month and he thinks things are going well. That was the reporting on the IEP, and the parent was really upset, saying that's not adequate. That was a conversation with one person one time. An anecdote is not a form of evidence. And I think I've made that point, so I can move on. The attraction of anecdotes is that they are easy, right? They don't require a lot of response effort from us, but they're not acceptable. They're the weakest form of proof. An IEP with measurement that does not include an anecdote is a beautiful thing. I would compliment an IEP with no anecdotal data collection. In God we trust, all others must bring data. This would be a bumper sticker on my car. I think Dr. Deming was an economist who said this. So, in terms of measurement, you've got summative and formative, and I've kind of broken down what I think is in your handout over these two slides. So summative assessment is at the end like a final exam. It doesn't let me know how you've been doing along the way if you've been struggling. I just get an assessment at the end of the course, at the end of the term. So if I do assessment in June, 10 months have gone by, and if you fail spectacularly on the summative assessment showing you haven't achieved anything, then really I've wasted 10 months of valuable resources because we should have known this much earlier and done something about it. So the con of summative assessment is it's not sensitive to incremental change and the progress that occurs during our teaching. We really want to be sensitive to incremental change so we can move rapidly at our students' pace. Formative assessment is much better. IEPs, they really like formative assessment. So repeated measures, things that you can do on a daily basis or even weekly or monthly, is way better than waiting till the end of the school year, right? The more often you can measure, the more sensitive your measurement will be. It's just a principle of measurement. Count per initiations daily. Why can't I count that? The number of times our student with autism goes up to socially initiate with a peer, I could count that daily, and I could track to see whether that's holding steady, increasing, decreasing. Weekly, I could do, if we're doing typing every day, maybe once a week, I do a fluency test to see how many words per minute are we doing. And if I'm seeing those data probes going up over time towards our goal, that can be adequate data. Sure, measuring it every day would be even more sensitive, but perhaps that's impractical and a bit of overkill. So with your data, it's always a matter of meeting our obligation to provide measurement without doing overkill necessarily, because that's just not a good use of resources. The pro of formative assessment is it is very sensitive to small change because you're testing it regularly. It allows for mastery quickly. It allows us to know, oh, this is done. Let's move on to the next thing. Next evolution, please. Of equal importance, it helps us identify when something's not working right. So you guys are all familiar with mastery criterion. Like if you get 100% 3 days in a row, that's mastered, move on to the next thing. It's equally important to have, I typically refer to this as a decision criterion. So it's the opposite of mastery criterion. If you're below 50% or if you haven't made 100% after a certain number of days, stop, get some help. Try and figure out why hasn't this been improving, right? Don't just continue, if your data is really poor, like 0% for 20 days in a row. Like after 3 days of 0, we should have stopped and done something different. Why do we continue to get zeros all month long? That's a poor waste of time, right? So that's equal importance. That's where this idea of database decision-making comes in. The frequent measurement allows us to change to the next evolution or to problem solve and fix if our instruction isn't working. So now I'm going to share with you a bunch of data sheets. So this is for one of my students, a token reset. So this particular student is on something called a differential reinforcement schedule, and every 20 minutes of following 3 important school rules, he gets a token. And as he earns tokens, he can cash them in for really valuable things for him. And so our data collection is we don't really count how many tokens he's earning. What we do keep track of is when he breaks a rule, there's a response cost. He's got to give up one of his tokens. And that's a measure of error, the occurrence of errors, and that's sensitive to change. And so all we do in terms of data to track this system, it's every 20 minutes all day long, is simply plot if we have to take a token away, we fill in a box. And so here's what his data looks like. Anyone see the story that this is telling? Mondays are rough, right? And so in the absence of this data, this is showing what actually happens. But if I don't have this data and I just go ask the SEA or a teacher, how's it going? They would probably say something like, it seems to be getting better, but we have some problem behavior every week. That would be an accurate statement, not fully accurate. If you've got data, you can say, more than just it's getting better, we see a decreasing trend. He's losing fewer tokens per week, but Mondays in particular are a problem. We need help with fixing Mondays, because that's the lingering problem. The data allows us to be much more specific in talking about how it's going and identifying where do we need to allocate resources, right? While the resource teacher can come in and provide support on this on Wednesday. Well, if you've got data, you'll know that we don't need her on Wednesday. We need her on Monday, right? That helps allocate resources more efficiently. Here's another example. Baseline, this student does not pee at school all day long. Not necessarily a problem. Lots of kids don't go to the bathroom at school. Except this student goes regularly at home in the evenings and weekends, and after school will show up at home just urgent. It's now critical that I have to pee, and there can't be any traffic on the way home, or we might have an accident. And so the issue now becomes, it's kind of rigid. If you have to go that bad, please pee at school, right? You could pee in the afternoon. And so this is just bathroom use at school, so that we can just track the number of times that she goes. You can see that we set the maximum at 3, because we're thinking there's no way she'll ever pee 3 times at school. We're hoping for just once, because that would make her more calm at the end of the day. It would allow mom to have a more peaceful ride home, right? So there's some simple data to track that. Here's some beautiful graph data. This graph displays the amount of problem behavior that we had at the beginning of the school year. In November and December, behaviors hit a high of 20 incidences per day. And so what you see is a few days of nothing, but then there's problems every day, and it's this escalating trend. And the beauty is, it doesn't take a lot of skill to figure out an Excel document. You just open an Excel file, put in the data in a column, put the numbers beside it, and then you can just click and it'll make a graph for you. That's all that this takes. I know it sounds really simple, but make friends with an Excel geek to help you with that. But then you can graph this, right? And we can see the picture, and this line that you see here is a nice simple feature in Excel where I can just click on the data, and then it'll say, do you want to add a trend line? And I click yes, and then it draws this line which shows the linear relationship between the data points. So this line here is the trend, and we can see that the problem behavior is getting worse, right? So when it's reporting period and we have to talk about problem behavior, we have data to show how many times it's happened, and it's actually getting worse right now. This nice graph shows that the students' problem behaviors have greatly decreased. You see a downward trend now. Since April, the highest occurrence has been no greater than 5 per day. Remember back in November, it was 20. We've also had many days with no incidents of problem behavior. So you can look down here and see all the days where there was nothing happening. And one of the values of something like that is we can go back and look at, well, what was happening on those days, right? What are the variables associated with really good days? Is there any information we can glean there that's going to help the other days where we do have problem behavior? So that would be around, that long-term goal 3 of behavioral/independence. The student has a problem behavior goal. By the way, as a bit of a soapbox aside, we try to avoid saying behavior to refer to problem behavior, because technically behavior refers to anything that a living person does is behavior, right? Problem behavior should be called problem behavior. So I've got a behavior kid. I'm like, that's good that you have a behavior kid, because otherwise you'd have a dead kid, right? Problem behavior. So I go out of my way to model that. You mean problem behavior? Well, we had behaviors today. Do you mean problem behaviors today? Right? Let's be specific about what we're talking about. Here's another bit of data for a student's STO 2.2a. This particular program was, we were teaching her to label a picture from her life with a friend beside her, and then answer one of the friend's questions. The SCA who did this is sitting at the back. And what happened here was, why was there no data here? Well, it took some time to get the pictures together, and then we got the material, and then we could start teaching it. And the students started picking this up. You see this increasing trend here. And then she was labeling the picture and answering the student's question. And then the data kind of tanks, and something went wrong. Well, the data would allow us to kind of infer, well, what went wrong here? And if I recall correctly, I think what went wrong is the pictures that we kept talking about, we didn't refresh them. And so she kind of got tired about labeling the same stupid pictures of her house and her life and answering the same kind of silly questions from her friends, right? And so again, this goes back to we made an instructional mistake where it was going really well and we just needed to change the antecedents. It was our responsibility in the Learn unit to refresh those pictures because she was picking it up and this is just, she's no longer motivated by these pictures, right? So the data tells a story. I said earlier that I'd show you some data around transitions. This is transitions, task transitions. So this is between tasks at a desk. And what you can see here is she picked this up really rapidly and met our criterion. So she became more flexible in transitioning from math to reading, et cetera. And we don't need a whole lot more data points than that, right? We have enough data here to show it started low and it went high. This is achieved. Done. Move on to the next thing. Here's some cool data. The importance of that, as we talked about this morning, the present level, the baseline data. This is her transitioning in hallways at school, between rooms. What do you see in this data? She started above 80%. So really, we sat around the IEP, we came up with this goal, we wrote it down, we used precious minutes and seconds to do this, and then when we went to do it, it turns out she was already doing this, right? And so there's an illustrative example of why it would be helpful to do a probe in advance, because the probe might have shown us that, hey, she's actually much better at this than we thought, right? This isn't the end of the world by any means, right? Because we actually did something and it was really rapidly effective because her baseline was already so high, right? That's not the end of the world, but it shows the importance of getting that data in the beginning, because this data would have shown that we don't need a goal here. Recess transitions were another story, right? When the bell rings and the students leave the playground and go in, you're supposed to go with everybody else. You can't run away, you can't stay on the playground, and there's a lot of prompt dependency and waiting for prompts. And what you see here from November through May is this increasing trend, a few ups and downs, but over time, she hit this criterion here, right? That's, I think that's just below 80%, where she was pretty good with her independence and coming in at recess. The SCA didn't necessarily have to worry that the student would go missing, right? She had gained the skill and increased her independence, and that work still continues. So this is data that was reported in an IEP meeting that was collected by an SEA. It was graphed collaboratively. I think I might have helped set up the Excel. And the parent was really pleased with this. And as a behavior geek, I was over the hill, I was ecstatic to see this. This is a great meeting. Look, we've got graphs at this meeting. But I shouldn't get so excited about that because it's so unusual, right? The point here is we should be striving towards this as the standard practice. We should have some basic graphs and displays of the data for all of our goals, and that should just be part of our procedure, have them in the IEP meetings. So this is an example of what's possible with not a whole lot of extra effort. How do you get this data? So in this case, the case manager makes a data sheet following the IEP. It's kept in the student binder or on a clipboard, and SEAs take the data during the day. The case manager then inputs the data into Excel at the end of the day, or it could be done at the end of the week, depending on how often you were going to look at it. And this is a report from a different teacher who took some data for me in her IEPs. She said, this made report card time easy, as I had all of the information I needed instead of asking EAs and going around and gathering information about student progress. She just open a file and just drag and drop graphs in to report on the IEP and to report at report card time. It made it really, really easy. So graphs in the IEP speak volumes, right? They're very impressive. Look at the story in the data. If you see the line going up or you want a line to go up, that shows progress. It's better than an anecdote saying, yeah, we think things are getting better. How much better? The line will show you how much better, right? This should become just a matter of course for us. And I know this can seem really daunting. In particular, as I said earlier, sensitive to the fact that there's limited time and resources. Some of you are going, when would I have the time to set this up, right? I'll comment about that in a few moments. So here's some sample data sheets that go along with our STOs. I mentioned Math UC earlier. What you'll see is that the Math UC program, I think there's 35 or 36 levels in level alpha, and each lesson has A, B, C, D, E, F, and then it goes to lesson 2, A, B, C, D, E, F, and then lesson 3. And so we just made up a data sheet to track the units in the math curriculum. And we present it the first time and we record the percent correct independently. And if it's not 100%, then we repeat the lesson again. And if it's not 100%, then we repeat the lesson again. And this is really an important instructional strategy message for kids with autism is they tend not to be single trial learners. If you think about general education, All right, today we're talking about the First World War. I'm going to say it once, I'm going to quiz you once, and then we're moving on to the next thing tomorrow. Education moves very, very rapidly. If a student could only respond to that lesson with a whole bunch of help and prompts, then they really haven't learned it, because if you tested them again, they wouldn't pass that test. Right? That single exposure and bit of help wasn't actually teaching. It was a bunch of prompting that didn't result in learning. And so we need repetition. If you can't do it perfectly the first time, then we're going to repeat it with teaching and prompt fading until you get it. Right? And so that's what this data sheet prompts and builds in. So here's what the data looks like. September 4th, 56% on 1A. We repeated it the next day, went up to 89%. Our criterion is 100%. On the third exposure, the student got 100% correct. Now you could argue he memorized it, and to some extent that could be true. But that's better than having one exposure with no learning and then moving on to the next thing. And as you move through systematically through the curriculum, if he is just superficially memorizing, that will become apparent to you. Surprisingly, more often than not, that doesn't happen. It does reflect genuine learning. September 6th, we moved on to 1B, got 100% the first time. We don't need to do this one again. So the same day, we went on to 1C, got 76%. We repeated it the next day, 100%. September 10th, I went on to 1D, 100%. Good, move on to 1E, 100%. The next day, I ran out of time teaching that day. September 11th, 33% on 1F. September 12th, 45%. September 13th, 33%. Now our data is showing there's something new introduced in 1F, which is the student is struggling with. There might be some new concept, and we might have to pause this program and do some remedial instruction, some breakout teaching to fix whatever the barrier is, and then go back onto the program and keep moving through until we hit the next barrier. Right? And that will be our instruction and data collection in math for the year. So how would you report on this progress? The IEP short-term objective could be, we'll complete Math UC Alpha program by June, because it is a year-long program. So in the fall report card, I can look at that data sheet where I know it goes from lesson 1 through lesson 35 or 36, and I can calculate. We're 25% of the way through. We're on our way. And we've got daily data to back this up. The winter report card, 67% of our way through Alpha. By the time we get to the spring, we'll say completed Alpha in May, and then we moved immediately into Beta, which is the next program, the next level up. And we're already 13% of our way through Beta, which means in September, we're going to continue where we left off in Beta and move through until we get to the next level and the next level. Right? So that's some basic reporting that provides some basic accountability. Here's a data sheet for a student where we wanted to fade being in separate environments. We wanted to spend more time in the classroom. And so this is 9 to 9:30, 30-minute increments through the school day. And if we spent the entire time in the classroom, not in the special ed room, we fill in the box. And as we see more boxes being filled in, we see more time in the classroom. And after a period of time of taking this data, it was almost entirely black. I can do a quick count and calculation. It's like 93% of the time, we are not in special education. That was the goal. The parent didn't want the child being removed all the time. We're done. We don't need to collect this data anymore. Good job to the SEA and the teacher. We're now fully integrated in the classroom. This is a data sheet, an actual sample. I took a photograph of one of my students where he had a really serious problem behavior episode at school, and the school wasn't comfortable with him, safety-wise, with him being in the classroom. And so literally overnight, they built a padded room for him and didn't allow him in the classroom, which to me was not appropriate. It was overkill, but they're operating out of an abundance of caution because they have to address safety. I understand that. So my first response was, okay, now we need to start getting him back into the classroom because he can't stay here. Let's get him back into the classroom. And we spent almost an entire school year where it really didn't happen. And mom would ask for anecdotes and the school would say, well, you know, we went in there, got a book, I think on Wednesday. Well, how is this moving in a systematic way forward? And the mom actually stepped up and advocated after a year of not being happy with him being just suddenly pulled out and no longer with his friends. She said, I need to see a plan of him being systematically reintroduced into his classroom. And I want to see that it's happening multiple times a day. I want to know for how long. I want to know what he's doing in there. And so they came up with this data sheet, and his SEAs implemented this. It was fantastic. You can see April 6th, 11 o'clock, he did activities. And activities means his package of learning materials. They're his customized activities. He was in there for 10 minutes. Successful? Yes. And so what you see here is was there or was there not problem behavior? it's almost exclusively yeses. And then if you counted this up, you would see that every day they're spending more and more time doing more and more inclusions into the regular classroom. And this made mom feel so much better because now she knew what he was doing and how much time he was spending in the classroom. And because they're taking this data, then when I go and visit, I quickly take it and I throw it into Excel and I make a graph. And this is what a graph looked like. This was minutes in class without problem behavior, September 9th to November 29th of last academic year. And you can see it was like 4 or 5 minutes a day in class. The rest he was isolated. And then it slowly increased. They went crazy one day and kept him in for 90 minutes, 70 minutes. And it slowly increased. And the other thing that happened here is that the school staff were very hesitant and they were fearful of what if he hits somebody? And this allowed them to see he's been really successful and he's increasingly spending time without any problems. And that made them more confident that they could do more and more of this. So this was the fall data. And if I graphed the data in April, May, and June, the average was around 60 minutes a day that he was in the classroom. And part of the good news there was he was also out at recess and lunchtime. So that adds to the time that he was integrated with his peers and not kept in this artificial isolated setting. Okay? So that's what data can do for us. And it's not that difficult to collect. And it provides that accountability and it can make people feel good. It makes parents feel good. It makes the SEAs feel good to see their work showing up as a picture and people reacting to it. Right? It allows us to make database decisions. Here's another data sheet that I made for one of my students. This is for daily language review. So this is a structured language program that teaches grammar and punctuation. And what I said earlier is you can't do a lesson once and then move on to the next one if the student hasn't demonstrated competence with the current lesson. It doesn't make sense to move forward if you're not perfect at where you are, right? This linear process. So all we did here was we set up a data system that showed the number of corrects the first time we did the worksheet. And then the next day, when we did some prompting and error correction to help him understand where he made mistakes. And then the next day, we would represent a fresh copy of the same data sheet. And what do you see is he went from 10 corrects to 14 corrects. And these are the errors. You see the errors dropping. So this shows us a few things. One is when we do the prompting and coaching, this actually is having an educative effect. How do we know that? Because when we give him the same material the next day, he does better. That shows us that we actually accomplished teaching the day before. And the other thing that you can see, especially with these last data points, is his corrects on the first opportunity are slowly increasing, which means he seems to be getting this. This is paying off. If his corrects were consistently low the first time and then jumped up the next day, that would indicate a problem, meaning over successive pages, he's not actually learning the concepts therein. Otherwise, his first opportunity performance should be higher, right? We should see better data, better performance, more accuracy, if he's really learning the concepts that the program we hope is teaching him.